Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today the webinar topic is Creative Partnerships Growing Farm to School with Farm Credit. I'm Stacy Maelstrom, Communications Director for the National Farm to School Network. Thank you all for joining us. I know folks are still going to be coming online here for the next couple of minutes, but we'll go ahead and get started. These first couple slides, people can jump in when they get here. Today's webinar is brought to you by the National Farm to School Network, a hub for information, advocacy, and networking in the farm to school movement, and Farm Credit, a nationwide network of borrower-owned lending institutions that provide farm loans, rural loans, and other agricultural loans across the U.S. We're going to get to know Farm Credit better in a minute, but first let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Helen Dombalis, National Farm to School Network Director of Programs, based in Fort Collins, Colorado, and Sarah Tyree, Vice President of Government Affairs for CoBank, a Farm Credit member institution, and she's joining us from Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to go through a few different topics. Helen's going to introduce us to farm to school in rural and agricultural communities. Then later she'll walk us through some ideas on how to partner with your local farm credit organization. Sarah is going to introduce us to the Farm Credit Network and walk through a partnership her organization CoBank formed with a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. to extend the season for local food. At the end of the presentation, we're hoping to have about 10 minutes for questions. Feel free to ask questions as you think of them during the presentation by typing them into the question window on your webinar control panel. We're recording today's webinar and it will be archived on our website at farmtoschool.org, where you can find past webinars and many more farm to school resources. Now I'm going to hand things over to Helen to get us started.
Great, thanks Stacy, and thanks to Sarah for joining us today, and a huge thanks to Farm Credit for partnering with us on this project to talk about how we can grow farm to school in partnership with Farm Credit. So before passing it over to Sarah to talk about Farm Credit and the role that they play in supporting rural and agricultural communities, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the issues facing rural America and rural children and where farm to school comes into play. So as you can see here on the slide, rural communities are facing a number of challenges, from loss of population and outmigration to economic development challenges, including higher poverty and jobless rates than their urban counterparts. Additionally, we have an aging farmer population, as well as a decline in the number of farms as farms become consolidated and less farms are actually in place. As well, you can also see here that one of the significant challenges facing rural communities where farm to school really comes into play is the fact that farmers are actually receiving less cents out of every dollar that's being spent on food than they have previously, currently at 16%. And additionally, in recent years, and really over the last several decades, we've actually seen more farmers have to go off farm in order to bring in farm income. So as we look at these various challenges facing rural communities, we then look at where farm to school can address some of these. So farm to school, the literal farm to school, that local procurement where you're getting local products into schools, actually generates farm income because it provides new market opportunities for farmers. We also know that farm to school really helps bridge or build those connections between rural and urban communities. And examples of that include things like getting kids out to farms from urban communities, so just giving them a chance to go and spend a day on a farm and meet a farmer, or things like bringing a farmer to the classroom for a farmer visit where kids get a chance to really shake the hand of a farmer and get to know where food comes from. So when you see those things combined, improving market opportunities, creating connections for kids with farmers and with rural communities, what we also know is that farm to school therefore improves community engagement, and kids really take what they're learning through farm to school back home to their families, and then ultimately enhancing that connectivity to food and agriculture, which we've seen a loss of in the United States over the last decades. Next slide. So along with aiming to boost community and economic development, farm to school also really works to address health inequities that are facing our nation's children, including children that are living in rural communities. As you can see here on the slide, children in the U.S. are facing high percentages of overweight and obesity, And those challenges are exacerbated in rural communities, with about 25% or 1 in 4 children in rural communities living in poverty. What we know is that obesity and poverty are ultimately two sides of the same coin. Both of them really contribute to those health inequities. So for many of the children that are living in poverty, sometimes school meals are the only meals that they consistently get as a source of food. So what Farm to School really aims to do is address that school food environment where these children are getting sometimes their only meals, and then really bring in the full community at large to address these health inequities. So when Farm to School it comes into the picture in schools and in communities, what we see are things like increased consumption of fruits and vegetables, which makes sense if kids are growing the food in a school garden, if they're meeting the farmer out on a farm or having a farmer come to the classroom. When they actually go through that lunch line and it's Farmer Josie's broccoli and they've met Farmer Josie or they've grown that broccoli in the school garden, they're going to be much more willing to taste it and then try it and eventually like it because they have that personal connection with the food. So we see that Farm to School helps actually increase that consumption of produce. Additionally, and relatedly, Farm to School helps with things like increasing meal participation rates, which can help generate not only new children having access to those meals in the school, but also additional revenue for the school to be able to buy at a price point that will work better for them because they're buying more meals. Finally, I'll just point out that what we see benefiting children also really ultimately benefits families and communities as a whole. What we have seen through research on Farm to School is that what kids learn through Farm to School really translates into learning for the whole family. So kids take what they learn home with them. It improves family diets. It improves family purchasing, interest in purchasing local foods. And with that, I'll share one brief example, which is one of my favorite examples of communities and really families winning as a whole from Farm to School comes from Georgia, where a food service director shared with us that she got a phone call recently from a local grocery store manager who begged her to please start letting her know in advance when she was going to be doing local food taste tests in the school cafeteria, because what was happening is the kids were tasting these local foods from the farms, going home and asking their parents to go to the grocery store and then buy those same foods for them. And the grocery store was actually running out of those products much more quickly than they had anticipated. So it just is a really neat example to show how it's not just that kids are winning, but it's also that families are winning as a whole. And Stacey, if you'll transition to the next slide, I'll just show these points in one succinct way, which is that Farm to School really ultimately is a triple win. It supports children and child health, it supports farmers and farmer wealth, and then ultimately it supports communities and families as a whole. So with that, I'll now pass it over to Sarah to talk more about Farm Credit's role in supporting rural communities and agricultural communities.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. My name is Sarah Tyree, and I work with CoBank, and it is a great pleasure for me to be here today to talk about Farm Credit and how Farm Credit and Farm to School can work together. I want to focus first by giving an overview of Farm Credit. If you aren't familiar with us, give you a little bit of background about who we are and why getting to know your local Farm Credit Association is important. The Farm Credit system supports rural communities and agriculture with reliable and consistent credit today and tomorrow. We're a network of 80 local lenders that provide financial services to farmers and ranchers and rural businesses across the country. And something to think about when you think about these farm credit associations is that they're all different. Every association is set up as a cooperative, and their customer farmers or producers, they elect their own directors. And so they're governed by the folks in the local areas, and their focus is on the local area. And as you can imagine, similar to school boards, they're all very, very different. And so a connection that might be made in a local farm credit association in one part of the country may have a different dynamic with a local farm credit association in another area. Farm credit associations fund ag producers of all kinds, large and small, organic and conventional, and rural and urban communities. It's our mission to serve ag, and that means all of ag. You could do the next slide, please. Like I mentioned, again, the Farm Credit Associations are all different. And I think that when the schools or those involved in local farm to school, when they start reaching out, it's good to understand who the directors are, and that might be a good point of contact to begin with. Now, one thing I also want to differentiate is the local farm credit associations. They're the ones that have the authority or the ability to lend directly to farmers, producers, ranchers, aquatic producers, and they're different than CoBank. I work for CoBank, and we're part of the farm credit system, but we're one of the funding banks. And what makes CoBank a little bit different is that we have a national footprint. We lend to farmer-owned cooperatives. We also lend to rural infrastructure providers, that's rural electric co-ops, rural communication carriers, rural broadband providers, and also rural water and wastewater providers. So we're all part of the same system, but we're just a bit different. And one of the reasons why CoBank has gotten involved with the Farm to School Network is that we have seen the benefit to local farmers and the potential opportunity for farmers to form cooperatives to meet the needs of local procurement entities, institutions, whether it be schools or hospitals or other institutional buyers, to bring that local produce to those local institutions. Can I get the next slide, please? And because CoBank sees that value when institutions make that commitment to source local, we were looking for a strategic partner to figure out what are some of the best practices, what are some of the best ways to go about sourcing local, and as an institutional buyer, we see the economic value back to the farmers, and how can you expand upon that? And it just so happens about 3 blocks away from my office is a marvelous organization called DC Central Kitchen. And DC Central Kitchen is a social enterprise that's been around for about 20 years, and they made a commitment to source local about 9 years ago. And I think it's a great story of why they made that conscious decision to develop relationships with the local farmers. And for years, DC Central Kitchen has taken a philosophy of you don't waste food and you don't waste people. And for years, they were taking food that would have otherwise been thrown away and using it to feed those in need, and also having a culinary jobs training program. And about 10 years ago, they received contracts with DC Public Schools to basically provide lunch service for the schools. And for one of the first times ever, DC Central Kitchen had purchasing power. And after they were in this business for a little bit, the executive director made the conscious decision, here we have purchasing power with local taxpayer dollars. It's tomato season. Why aren't we buying tomatoes from our local farmers? Why do we have pallets of tomatoes from Belgium in our kitchen? And they created a program, and they started working with small and mid-sized farmers out in the Shenandoah Valley to purchase their local product. And the great thing about DC Central Kitchen is that they had the purchasing power not only to buy the farmers first, but they also had the ability to pay a fair market value for the farmers seconds. The seconds being those ugly vegetables and fruits that normally wouldn't be able to be sold on an auction. And that's just one of the nice partners with DC Central Kitchen is that they have a lot of volunteers that come to the kitchen to help chop and dice. So when I read about this program, we met with them, and we wanted to help them expand their capacity to use more local foods. And one of the first things that we did was provide a grant to help them purchase a refrigerated truck and a delivery van to transport the produce from the surrounding areas to DC. And it was just a great first step to build a relationship with DC Central Kitchen. And I also want to point out that one of the great things that they do with their school lunch program is, like what Helen was mentioning earlier, they do have those Vegetable Fridays where they introduce new vegetables to the school kids. And they also have a program in the city called Healthy Corners. And that is a program that's bringing fresh fruits and vegetables into corner markets that normally didn't sell anything fresh. And they, too, understand that when you have a taste test with a specific vegetable, they put in the recipe cards at the local corner markets with those vegetables of the produce that they're featuring that day. It's just that they understand that they have that opportunity to change eating habits, not only in the school but also back home. And that's just something I wanted to highlight about what they're doing. Can I get the next slide, please? And so after the first step of supporting the kitchen with 2 vehicles, the board of directors of CoBank saw the value in a partnership with the kitchen, and they approved a 4-year grant to increase the kitchen's capacity to transport, prepare, store, and distribute locally grown foods throughout Washington, D.C., and not only just to the schools, but to the homeless shelters, the rehabilitation clinics, and the neighborhood corner stores. And when we sat down with them and asked, what is it going to take to increase your capacity to purchase more local foods, they came up with something I hadn't thought of. It's actually storage space. When you have an abundance of fresh produce in the summer and fall months, how do you do light processing where you can, do the food washings, dehydration, do flash freezing, and then store or refrigerate that produce so you can use it through the winter months? And so part of our grant has helped DC Central Kitchen invest in those facilities, and they are now able to use not fresh, but local produce all throughout the school year. And so the lunch programs have local food in their menus, I think if not every day, every other day, even during the winter months. And it's just a great example of how CoBank has been able to partner with an institution that's made that commitment to source local and to help them extend their ability to use more of the local product. And it's been mentioned before, and I think it's important to mention again. When you are in farming, growing is for the most part the easy part. It's the marketing and the distribution that's sometimes the more difficult part. And it's amazing what transpires when you have institutional buyers like schools make that commitment to source local, and you see that economic value go back to the local farmer. And that's the reason why CoBank is supporting DC Central Kitchen and some of the other programs and overall the National Farm to School Network. So I'll pass it back over to Helen.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for sharing that incredible story. I think you really have brought to life what a partnership between a farm to school program and farm credit can look like, and it's really an incredible story. So I appreciate you sharing that. I am just going to spend the last few minutes before we go into Q&A talking about some other ideas like the one that Sarah just mentioned of how farm to school stakeholders can partner with your local farm credit associations. The thing I want to emphasize here, and Sarah mentioned this earlier, that's really key, is that building that partnership with farm credit in your local community is really all about good relationship building and thinking beyond just a grant or a sponsorship, for example, but really thinking about what that partnership can look like in a way that aligns with your goals as a farm to school stakeholder, or if someone is on the webinar as a farm credit association, what your goals are. So what we know about farm to school is that it looks different in every community. Every community has to decide for itself what its farm to school activities look like. And so the same really applies when you think about partnering between farm to school and farm credit, that it's going to look different everywhere. Sarah just gave this one example from Washington, D.C., and in the next few slides, I'll talk about a few other examples from around the country. But again, just reiterating the point that you really have to figure out what your local farm credit association has in terms of its goals, and then figure out where farm to school goals align with those farm credit goals in order to figure out how to work together. Next slide, Stacy. So one thing that Sarah just mentioned that's really key and important here is outreach. So she mentioned that marketing and outreach of products for farmers can oftentimes be the more challenging part. Well, so we know that, and then what we also know is that education is one of the 3 core elements of farm to school, along with the local procurement and school gardens. And so what it ultimately is all about, and I want to point out on this slide, is that it's about not only educating kids about where their food comes from, that piece I was talking about earlier about rebuilding that connection to food, but really also raising that awareness about farm to school, about the local farmers, that story that Sarah just brought to life of why those relationships and partnerships with your local farming community are so important. So the example I want to provide here is from American Ag Credit, who's a farm credit member institution serving some of the Midwestern and Western states. What American Ag Credit did recently is partner with a school district just down the street from me, actually, in Greeley, Colorado, the Greeley-Evans School District 6. And they funded school banners and then local newspaper ads during Farm to School Month, which takes place every year in October, and also did some ads and banners around National School Lunch Week. So by having that partnership with the American Ag Credit, the school district in Greeley, Colorado, was able to not only raise awareness about the farm to school work that they were doing already, but also educate the public about that value of local agriculture and really extend that school nutrition message throughout the whole community. So Sarah's earlier example really talked about why CoBank has that interest in farm to school and in supporting farm to school, because it helps build that relationship with the farmer and ultimately helps support the farmer. And so this example coming out of Colorado with American Ag Credit is another example of how that partnership really not only supports the farmer, but really helps support that education outreach community-wide. Stacy, if you want to go to the next slide. A few other examples that I want to mention are talking to local farm credit associations that you might be able to work with around supporting the farmers in your community. And Sarah already mentioned that that's ultimately what's so important for the work that they're doing is really supporting farmers. So one example that I'll mention on this slide is that we know sometimes schools or distributors are requiring certain food safety certifications in order for a farm to sell to that school. So one such certification is GAP, or the Good Agricultural Practices certification, which for farmers can oftentimes be quite expensive. So one thing that you could pursue, if you know that that's a challenge for farmers in your community trying to get involved in farm to school, is finding out whether your local farm credit association might want to provide some sort of cost share to offset some of that cost to enable the farmer the ability to do more to support and serve the local school. And then one other example on this that I'll mention, Sarah talked earlier about cosmetically imperfect seconds, or those quote-unquote uglier fruits and vegetables that are perfectly fine to eat, but they might not be pretty enough to go into the grocery store and put on a nice tomato display. We recently heard Sarah and then some of her colleagues at Farm Credit shared with us a story about how the Virginia Farm Credit actually supplemented the price of some of those cosmetically imperfect seconds in order to get them into schools. So those products were being sold at a lower price point, but what the Virginia Farm Credit Association did was help essentially cover some of the price of that product so that the schools could then get them into their cafeterias. Stacey, if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to give a few other types of examples of potential partnerships between Farm Credit and Farm to School. On this slide, you'll see some examples around infrastructure and production loans. So what we know is that schools aren't always equipped to actually receive food directly from farmers. So you may have a farmer with a truckload of butternut squash, but the school might not be ready for that school to back its truck up and have that unwashed, unpeeled, uncubed butternut squash arrive. So sometimes what schools are going to need is assistance with minimal processing, some of the things Sarah was mentioning earlier, as well as delivery needs. So, not needing 10 different farm trucks showing up, but needing someone to help with that supply chain to get the product from the farm to the school. So one example that I want to point out, and this is not a farm credit partnership that's already happened, but an example of an opportunity for a partnership with Farm Credit. The National Farm to School Network, through our story banking platform on our website during Farm to School Month last year, heard about a farm called the Abundant Table in Ventura County, California, that was having great success with Farm to School. So they talked about how they were a 4-acre diversified farm. They started growing just a special variety of sweet carrot for their local schools, and over the years started to build more and more of this partnership where they were selling lettuce and spinach and radishes and a whole bunch of other products. And what they realized is as that partnership was growing between that farm and the school, it was really good for their bottom line. They were able to generate more income. They had that more steady customer coming to them asking for product. But what ended up happening is they actually maxed out the capacity of the delivery van that they had to be able to meet that growing demand from the school for their product. So again, this isn't a partnership that has already happened with Farm Credit, but what it illustrates is an example of where a partnership could be formed. So that farm, for example, could go to its local Farm Credit Association and say, hey, we love Farm to School. We have this amazing relationship with our local school, but what we need is support to actually get a bigger refrigerator or a bigger van or more supply chain infrastructure, as Sarah mentioned earlier with CoBank, in place to actually support the growth of Farm to School between this farm and the school. On this final slide, I am just going to point out a few final examples. So we've talked about ways that you might be able to work with your local Farm Credit Association to support farmers, to support infrastructure, education, outreach, and marketing. Lastly, I'll just point out some other ways that you might be able to partner to receive financial support or sponsorships. And these include everything from if you're hosting a state or a regional farm to school conference, or you're trying to plan some of those farm field trips or get farmers to the classroom, some of the things I talked about earlier that really help to generate kids' interest in agriculture. You might be able to work with your local Farm Credit Association to pursue some of these opportunities as well. So finally, before I pass it to Stacey for Q&A, on this last slide, I just want to reiterate the point that that connection to your local Farm Credit Association really is the key to starting the conversation. If you're trying to find out who in your local area you can connect with, the first step is to go to the farmcredit.com website and enter your zip code to find out who that local lender is. When you reach out, introduce yourself. If you have any upcoming events like a conference or a farm field trip, invite those local contacts to actually come and just participate in Farm to School and see it in action. I think ultimately, when we think about relationship building, it really is just showing what it can mean in person, and seeing that connection in person can really help to start that conversation. Or if you don't have anything coming up, just set up a time to really chat and figure out what are your goals, what are your local Farm Credit Association's goals, and then how do those align? One other thing I'll mention, so everything I just shared is kind of if you're coming from the side of trying to figure out how to reach out to Farm Credit, for those of you on the webinar that are part of Farm Credit, you might be wondering how you can get in touch with the folks in your community or your state that are working on Farm to School activities. If you want to figure out who those folks are, go to farmtoschool.org, and then you can click on our network, and that'll lead you to a page where you can select the state that you're based in, and then from there you can figure out your point of contact for farm to school to make a connection that way. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Stacy for Q&A, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Sarah. Both of these ladies are going to stay on the line and are available for questions, and we encourage you to ask questions about Farm Credit, about CoBank, about any of the stories or examples that we shared. Another resource that came out of our work with Farm Credit this year is a fact sheet that does highlight a lot of those examples that Helen just gave, and features a few of stories that we shared as well as case studies from around the country. And that fact sheet is available on our website at farmtoschool.org in our resources section. If you search Farm Credit, it will come right up. And it's a great fact sheet. We shared it in our member newsletter last week, and we'll be sharing it with everybody who registered for the webinar. It is a fantastic resource for kind of hitting on all of these key points again, taking it to a conversation with your team, your farm to school team that you already have formed, or your partners, just propel that conversation forward. So while we wait for a few questions to roll in, Sarah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more specifically how that relationship between CoBank and DC Central Kitchen originally formed. How did that conversation start?
The conversation started by me making a cold call to DC Central Kitchen. And one of the reasons why I reached out to them was in doing research as to what organizations across the country were involved in not only farm to school, but dealing with food deserts, dealing with childhood obesity, dealing with making that commitment to source local. I did a Google search and found DC Central Kitchen. And I'd heard about them, but I really didn't know that much about them. And I think it's important to understand that one of the attributes of the kitchen that was very strong and compelling was their long-time ability to partner with others in the community. That they understood that they would be more beneficial to the city if they built on the partnerships of what other organizations were doing around the city. For example, when they take food that would have otherwise been thrown away and feed it to those in need, they created a partnership with 60 nonprofits all across the city. And the idea was if these various nonprofits, whether it be after-school programs, homeless shelters, a variety of different organizations, if they receive food for free or at a reasonable price, they could then devote their limited resources to fulfilling their specific mission. And if DC Central Kitchen could help all these organizations do what they do best by providing either free or discounted food, then the city would be better off. And that was very compelling. The ability to partner with others was very important.
Great. And Sarah, how did you guys identify that childhood obesity and childhood hunger or farm to school was the priority area that you would then be Googling to find that right organization to fit it? Was that a group kind of based on your guys' cooperative structure, how did that come about?
It came from our board. So as a cooperative, our customers are our owners, and our customer representatives are the folks who are our board members. And it was a board decision to make a commitment to focus on these areas.
Great. We still don't have any questions coming in and are happy to answer any questions that folks have. We have about 10 minutes left in our time together today. Feel free to use that webinar control panel to send us questions so we can clarify anything during the presentation. Helen, were there any other stories or that you wanted to share or questions that you have for Sarah? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but if we have any other stories, I have one I could share if you don't have any questions for Sarah right off the bat while you think about that.
Sure, yeah. I think one other neat example that's on our fact sheet, Stacy, that we might want to share is the example out of Nebraska where the local Farm Credit Association supported school gardens.
And that was through a grant program, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So we talked a little bit earlier in the webinar about the 3 core elements of farm to school local procurement. So that literal farm to school, getting those products into the cafeteria, education, which we mentioned earlier, and then school gardens being the 3rd core element. And so this example that you'll see for those of you who download that fact sheet Stacy mentioned, you'll see that there was a grant program to a school garden in York, Nebraska, where that school garden is now in place, and not only are kids learning from the school garden, but they are actually then using some of that school garden product in the cafeteria, which is just incredible because it really brings things full circle. The kids are getting to grow the product and then eat it in the cafeteria and really contribute to that connection to their food. So that's just one other example I think I would mention.
Great.
And then in terms of,
go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of a question for Sarah, Sarah, I'd love, you talked about how you kind of did that cold call to DC Central Kitchen. I'm just curious for folks that are listening to the webinar or may listen to it as a recording, do you have any other advice about how to pursue that partnership from a standpoint either of a Farm Credit Association or from the standpoint of a farm to school stakeholder who's really trying to figure out how to start that connection?
I mean, it's really about making the connections, reaching out, doing some research that, of what you can on the internet. And then if you can find out, like if you were wanting to reach out to the Farm Credit Associations, if you know who the directors are, and if you can find a connection to at least meet one of the directors, I think that's a nice way to start. But you just sometimes you just never know what those connections are. But when you have a great story and you're telling your story, that's when great things happen.
Absolutely. We have one question that just came in. Let's see here. The question is, Helen, and this might be a question for you, Helen. Are there procurement guidelines on purchasing cosmetically imperfect seconds? As a farm to school coordinator, we seem to struggle with procuring local foods year-round in competition with food service vendors. The bottom line is that we hear from contracted food service providers. They control ultimately how much local is purchased and when. So I think there's 2 questions in there, kind of how to work in systems that have food service providers and contractors, as well as are there procurement guidelines on purchasing cosmetically imperfect seconds?
Both great questions, and thanks to whoever asked that. So I'll answer the latter question first, and I think my answer will unfortunately be rather short. I don't know of specific guidelines around purchasing cosmetically imperfect seconds other than the guidelines that are already in place. So whoever is asking that question, you certainly, it sounds like, know that there are specific guidelines around school meals. So for example, if USDA themselves is doing the purchasing, the product has to be GAP certified. If you yourself, running a school district or working at a school is doing the purchasing, you can choose to get it through a distributor, you can get the product through USDA, you can get it from a local farm. You always need to check your state and local laws around food safety requirements. There are some states and locales that do have more strict food safety requirements, but ultimately, to my knowledge, there aren't any additional or second kind of on top of regulations or rules that you have to follow when you're trying to procure cosmetically imperfect seconds. So long as you're following those general procurement guidelines, and so long as you're also, of course, adhering to the nutrition requirements and nutrition standards that are in place for school meals, in terms of numbers of servings of fruits and vegetables and what have you. So that's unfortunately the best answer I can give on that. And then in terms of addressing or building that relationship with your local distributor, it does take time. When we look at the school food system as a whole, including that supply chain to get the product from farm to school, there are systems that have been in place for many, many years. There are ways that that product is getting from the farm to the school. And so what it sometimes takes is just continuing to push for that and explaining why your goals are to purchase local, and then understanding from that distributor side what their goals are. So it's kind of it's basically the exact same thing I was mentioning earlier around building that relationship with farm credit. I think applies for building that relationship with the distributor. Find out, have they purchased any from local producers before? If so, how did that go? Have they considered what those ultimate benefits are going to be to the whole community when they pursue that approach? And certainly if you face challenges with that, or if you want some examples, for example, of contracts that are in place, you could follow up with us, because there are a number of school districts and states that have really worked on kind of contract procurement examples for local procurement. USDA's Farm to School website as well has some of those examples that might be helpful. So it's really meeting them where they are and figuring out how you can work together. And one last thing I'll say on that is sometimes it's just a matter of starting small. So it may be that you just want to pick one product to start with during Farm to School Month, which is every October. So you may say, I just want to work with you, distributor, this Farm to School Month on getting apples in place so every kid in the school can eat a local apple for one day during Farm to School Month. So it may mean that you kind of need to start at one place, try it out, see how that works, and then grow your Farm to School program over time.
Great. Thank you, Helen. If there aren't any other questions, you still have another minute or so to send them in, but I'll just go to this slide here. A few things to keep in mind as you look ahead and want to know how to stay engaged and continue exploring this work. One thing, join our network. If you receive our newsletter, you'll get news from us about case studies, best practices, policy action that you can take to grow Farm to School, and more. You can save the date for the 8th National Farm to Cafeteria Conference next June 2nd through 4th. It's going to be in Madison, Wisconsin, and this is an amazing event bringing leaders and Farm to School practitioners from across the country, farmers and folks from school cafeterias and nutrition departments, all together to learn how do we continue to grow this, how do we form those new partnerships. You can connect with your National Farm to School Network state or regional lead at our website at farmtoschool.org under our network at the top. And they're also at our website at farmtoschool.org. We have many, many more resources in our resource library that may help you get started and get your program off the ground or take it to the next level. We have one more question that came in. I often hear from local producers they are having difficulties getting on the food service trucks as a vendor or as a USDA commodities producer. This is a barrier to putting local foods on our kids' plates. We're hosting local meetings with local producers to try to work out the bugs. Any suggestions? So I think this might be a question of if a producer may be too small. Sometimes local producers are too small for food service trucks to come and pick them up. And we've seen a lot of examples of communities that have used a food hub or have created food hubs to help solve that gap. An organization that can pick up from smaller farms and aggregate that food and to deliver to smaller schools. And one example of that is a project that's happening in Washington State, actually in Eastern Washington. It's a project called the Highway 395 Produce Corridor Project. And this is another farm credit project, actually. Northwest Farm Credit Services has been working with a food hub out of Spokane they just recently gave them a grant similar to sort of the relationship with CoBank and DC Central Kitchen. They gave a grant for refrigerated storage facilities along this Highway 395 corridor that went through rural communities north of Spokane. And this avenue, what they did is the food hub based in Spokane would go and pick up the food that farmers would leave in the refrigerated storage containers, and they'd bring it back to Spokane, aggregate the food, do some minimal processing, and then be able to deliver that to the schools. So that's one example of where a food hub, and similar to DC Central Kitchen, is acting kind of as that middle player for some farms and schools that weren't making that connection through their typical distributor. Helen, do you have anything to add to that question of advice for that conversation that is starting between those local producers trying to bridge that delivery mechanism?
Sure, absolutely. And Stacy, thanks for sharing that great example out of Washington State. It's yet another, as you said, example of the farm to school farm credit partnership. I think the only thing I'd add, so Stacy certainly talked about the role that food hubs can play in addressing this. Whoever asked that question, you are absolutely right that especially when you're trying to sell to a distributor or to USDA who's doing the purchasing through USDA foods, there are some oftentimes minimum quantities. So for example, USDA used to only allow full truckload quantities of product. The National Farm to School Network and some of our partners a couple of years back did raise this question with USDA and push for allowing half truckloads as opposed to full truckloads of product, which USDA has been working on, which is incredibly exciting. So I think that even if you're at a farm or you're working with farmers that may not be able to supply that level of product, at a half truckload or whatever it is a distributor is requiring, that's where food hubs and partnerships with other farms, as Stacy was saying, can be so incredibly valuable. Because if you are working with schools of a certain size, which most are, unless it's the very smallest of schools, an individual farm might not be able to supply that full quantity that's needed of carrots or beef or whatever it is. But what you can do is connect with folks in your local area and connect those farmers to figure out how they can work together and get contracts in place with the school or with the USDA or with the distributor to basically join product together to then get it to that school.
Great. Thank you, Helen. We are just over time, but thank you everyone for being with us today. Thank you, Sarah, very much for your time and telling us about the program with CoBank and DC Central Kitchen. That's a fantastic program. Thank you, Helen, for going through all of these examples. And we'll be sharing the fact sheet we mentioned with all of you. But for now, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@farmtoschool.org, and we would be happy to help. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.